Hello and welcome to today's very special webinar. My name is Lauren Cornegay-Deller and I am the Adult Programs Coordinator here at the National Museum of the Pacific War. Like I said, today is a special webinar just for our members, so we're very happy to have you all here. As you guys know, we have some special guests with us, guest speakers. Today we are joined with Jon Parshall and Jon McManus. Wave, guys. Hi.
Hey,
I think we're going to kick it off today with Jon Parshall, so take it away.
All right. So the challenge for both Jon and myself today is to give some of our favorite Chester Nimitz stories, this being the old man's birthday as it is. And so I'd like to just talk about his manner of taking over the command of the Pacific Fleet at the beginning of World War II. And so without further ado, on Christmas Day, Nimitz climbs into a PB-2Y2 Coronado seaplane in San Diego and takes off for the 17-hour flight over to Pearl Harbor. And arrives there on Christmas morning, and before he gets off the plane, he personally shakes the hand of every one of the crewmen and thanks them for having taken him out there and, missing family time on Christmas to do that. And before he would have landed in Pearl Harbor itself, he would have seen views like this of the shattered battleships at Battleship Row, including 3 sunk vessels in the Arizona, West Virginia, and Oklahoma, and damage to the Maryland and Tennessee. The California is off to the left of your screen, also sunk. They were still pulling bodies out of the harbor at this time. So, the situation was still just absolutely calamitous. And Nimitz was a submariner himself, and so he decided to take command of the fleet on a submarine, in this case, the USS Grayling. And you see here a picture of the Grayling that Nimitz autographed after the ceremony to commemorate that. So here is the scene on the Grayling as he's taking over, and it's just so diminutive when you think about it. I mean, he normally, most Pac fleet commanders would have taken over on a battleship, of course, but we haven't got any battleships that are actually upright and unscarred at this point in time. So yeah, he's taking over basically down by the docks is kind of what it comes down to. The Grayling is moored basically where you see this submarine tender here in this particular photo. So on board the submarine's deck with him, we got Nimitz in the center. We have his disgraced predecessor, Admiral husband Kimmel, standing off to the right there. And then General Delos Emmons, who is taking over the Army contingent here on the Hawaiian Islands. He has already relieved General Walter Short in the aftermath of the attack. First thing that happens when Nimitz takes over is he begins pinning medals on people's chests. So we have here the crew of a Navy bomber that had gone out in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. I believe they were looking for the Japanese fleet. They didn't find anything, but they still got medals for it. And then Nimitz piles into his car and goes basically the block and a half down to the operations building in the submarine center. That's going to be his headquarters for the next 6 months or so. And lines up the senior officers. He's got Kimmel, of course, off to his side and, tells them that he is here and what it is that he intends to do. More importantly, I think, is what happens immediately after that, in that he then goes over into his headquarters and greets the staff of Kimmel, who are all to a man expecting that they are going to be relieved and sent packing for their part in this disaster. And instead, Nimitz greets each one of them personally, looks them in the eye, and tells them, I need your help. I have complete confidence in you, and I need all of you to be helping me turn around the situation that we have here. And one officer remembered afterwards that it was like someone had opened a window in a stuffy room, and he just got this breath of fresh air coming into this command staff. For some further remarks on Nimitz's command style, because I think it's illustrative of the man, I want to give you some remarks that were recorded by the gentleman that you see on the left, who is Lieutenant Hal Lamar, who was Nimitz's flag lieutenant from August of 1942 throughout the remainder of the war. Lamar was a 30-year-old naval reservist from Los Angeles, California, and he was colorblind, and so he was not going to be able to serve at sea. Nimitz had worked with him pre-war and very much wanted him back, called him a tower of strength and a great comfort to him. And Lamar gave a number of accounts after the war, both oral accounts and written accounts. And I just want to give a shout out here to Rachel Barnett, who is the queen of the museum's archives, and she alerted me to the presence of these accounts. And so thank you very much for that, Rachel. Lamar remembered that every morning at 11 a.m., any ship skipper who was new to the theater was invited to call at Nimitz's office. And according to Lamar, Nimitz was a master at gleaning their thoughts on the war in the Pacific. He was an outstanding raconteur and loved to tell humorous stories. One of the things that the Admiral did was that he was just as cordial to the Lieutenant JG of an LST as he was to the captain of a battleship. He'd sit them down and tell them how he was glad to have them in the fleet, so that the captain of the LST felt just as important as the captain of the battleship. They were part of the team, his team, and that's the way he got them pulling together. Lamar remembered, too, that if he had to dress somebody down, and he did dress people down when they needed it, the Admiral always believed that you praised them in public, but you chide them in private. And bottom line, in the words of Pacific Fleet's press relations officer, a guy named Waldo Drake, he recalled in 1969 simply, Nimitz knew how to deal with people. And so with that, I'd just like to give a salute to the old man, the finest naval officer in the history of the United States Navy, I believe. And with that, I would love to turn it over for a little Q&A before I hand it off to Jon McManus.
I have one.
Hit me.
Okay, so in the photo with Hal Lamar, is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
There is a canine companion.
Yes.
Can you tell me anything about the canine companion?
I sure can. He came into the picture at roughly the same time that Lamar came back into the picture, so August or September of 1942. And the dog's name is Macalapa, named after the headquarters, but most people just called him Mac. So he was also Nimitz's companion throughout the remainder of the war. And when Nimitz eventually shifted his headquarters over to Guam in early 1945, both Hal Lamar and Mac came along on the plane with him and stayed with him for the rest of the war. So, got a question here from David. David asking about, did Nimitz ever offer a more detailed rationale for the invasion of Peleliu, and his chain of command recommended terminating the invasion? And on that score, one of my thoughts given by Ian Toll in Twilight of the Gods, that Nimitz feared losing control of the 1st Marine Division to MacArthur if the invasion were canceled. It's a really complex question. And we don't have definitive written documentation on the part of Nimitz for that. Nimitz declined to ever go into his reasoning. I personally am of the belief that he had given MacArthur his word, that we were going to do this operation. And of course, logistics in the Pacific require this sort of push methodology, and that if I'm going to be invading an island as distant as Peleliu, I've got to have the transports and all that stuff, in motion weeks and weeks before that invasion is actually going to happen. So there's a lot of machinery that's got a lot of inertia behind it. And Nimitz had received some recommendations that maybe this operation was unnecessary, but he was unable to get a hold of MacArthur at the time because MacArthur was on a ship and was operating under conditions of radio silence. And in lieu of that, the evidence would tend to suggest that Nimitz is just like, well, I guess I better go ahead and, keep this rocking and rolling. And the result was, of course, a disaster. So Yeah, I think you have to look back at this as probably Nimitz's unfinest hour of the Pacific War, in that was an unnecessary operation. But he was not one to kind of second guess other people that were making decisions in the field a lot of the time. And so, yeah, he didn't come back and second guess that himself. So, um, Nat would like just a brief update on how Nimitz was chosen or his early life in Texas. And so I'm going to actually take the first part of that question because it's a lot easier for me. The reason Nimitz was chosen for command of Pac Fleet, he'd actually been offered it a year earlier by FDR, but had turned it down at that time because he was junior to a lot of the admirals like Kimmel, and felt that there would be resentment if he, were passed over the heads of a lot of other officers to take the fleet over. So when Kimmel unfortunately ends up being on the receiving end of this, revolutionary Japanese attack, and a new replacement for Pac Fleet is needed. At this point, FDR is not brooking any no's on the part of Nimitz. He basically tells Nimitz, "You're going to take this job and head on out there." So that's how he ends up taking that on. Question from John: when he awarded the medals, did it include Dory Miller? So Dory Miller, of course, African American sailor who had fought pretty valiantly during the Battle of Pearl Harbor. There's, of course, a famous photo of Nimitz pinning the medal on his chest. I don't know that Nimitz had any second thoughts about Dory Miller getting the Navy Cross as opposed to the Medal of Honor. Nimitz's views on race would not comport with our current views on race, although I do think that Nimitz was certainly open to acknowledging the fact that Dory very much deserved that Navy Cross being pinned on his chest. But just given the hurdles that there were at that point in time to any African American or person of color getting the MOH, it was just never going to happen. So, we don't have any, direct information on how he would have regarded that. But there you go. Finally, let's see here. Can you tell me Nimitz's interactions with Admiral Togo on his flagship, the Mikasa? Ooh, I'm going to skip on that one, other than to say that Nimitz did know Admiral Togo and was instrumental after the war in putting forward funding for resurrecting the Mikasa basically from its grave. The Mikasa had been the flagship of the Japanese fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. And after the war, of course, it was kind of a mess, and the Japanese were thinking of scrapping it. And Nimitz recognized that this is an incredibly valuable artifact, and we should make it possible, if at all possible, to preserve this particular battleship. And it is still in Tokyo today. I visited it just about a year ago. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Lauren. And actually, no, I'm going to turn it over directly to John, and I'll hopefully get to some of these other questions when we do the joint Q&A later on. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, John. And I'd be glad to take a crack at some of these questions too, and maybe add a few thoughts. Want to also just, I don't want to show a ton of images. I wanted to show one. Okay, so I want to focus a little bit on, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for making time to be here with us today. All the members for supporting the museum. We all love and know is such a special place, and kind of just doing what we're doing here today, which is advancing the knowledge of this incredibly important event, the Pacific Asia War. So appreciate that, everybody being a part of this. And I want to focus primarily on Nimitz's relationship with General Douglas MacArthur, who, as we know, is not always the easiest individual to get along with. So Chester Nimitz, in my view, was just one of the most patient and tolerant people that the Americans could have had in that kind of situation. MacArthur, of course, was mercurial. He was conspiracy-minded. He was underhanded. He was also gentlemanly. He was also kind of broad thinking in a way. He was courageous at times, but he was very very clannish, in terms of how he wanted to run his war. And he had the view, of course, that pretty much everybody was subordinate to him in a way because he was senior over everybody, if you really go back far enough in the American military hierarchy at that point. And so MacArthur had some very defined ideas, of course, of how he thinks the war ought to be fought. Famously, of course, thinking that the United States had to return to the Philippines and have kind of redemption, not just for the U.S., but for MacArthur, too. So really from the beginning, MacArthur sees Nimitz as an adversary. And I think if you've got a different officer there as commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet and, the larger theaters that Nimitz commanded, if you've got someone with a different kind of adversarial or kind of, again, kind of clannish personality, there could have been a real disaster for the U.S., in my opinion, with the Navy and the Army in particular working at cross purposes, but rival theater commanders constantly bickering between them. MacArthur wanted to bicker, and Nimitz would sort of refuse to play. In a way, he was quite patient, quite forbearant, and always thinking about the larger team. And I think this goes back into Nimitz's early days in the military when he was a Naval Academy midshipman. This was at a time when there was a terrible row between two of the leading admirals in the United States Navy, Admiral Schley and Sampson. And this became a kind of public thing. Great stink, awful kind of publicity for the Navy. And I think that Nimitz took that to heart, and he never liked the idea of sort of seniors butting heads in public. And even in private, in his view, he was always willing to kind of listen to MacArthur's point of view. And yet they didn't really work very closely together for about 2 years or so in the war. And MacArthur would privately talk to his staff, and he would mispronounce Nimitz's name. He'd call him Nimitz whenever he was angry at him because he was convinced Nimitz was taking away his resources when MacArthur ought to properly have them. Well, they finally meet in March 1944 when MacArthur invites Nimitz to Australia and to begin some joint planning on the heels of a major Joint Chiefs directive that happened at March 12th of that month. And so he welcomes Nimitz, gives him the 5-star treatment. Nimitz comes with gifts for MacArthur's family, orchids for MacArthur's wife, Jean, silk play suits for MacArthur's son, Arthur, candy for the family. And they really kind of sit down for the first time together and work out exactly how they're going to work their grand strategy going forward. Now, this works for about 9 months or so in the war, a little bit less, actually, it's about 5 months in the war. Eventually, in that image you saw there, they're going to convene at Pearl Harbor with President Roosevelt and also Admiral Leahy to decide on basically what we're going to do towards the end of 44 and into 45. What you're looking at there is something that's kind of a snapshot moment of this kind of larger debate over what is to be our grand strategy towards the last stage of the war. Are we going back to the Philippines, or are we going to invade Formosa? And the Navy's position tended to be pro-Formosa because Ernie King wanted it that way, and Nimitz had adopted that view. MacArthur obviously wants the Philippines, so partly that's playing out in front of MacArthur, and yet it was a by the testimony of those who were there, it was a very respectful and polite kind of environment, just as it had been when MacArthur finally meets face-to-face with Nimitz. Again, I would maintain, as we're talking about Nimitz today and thinking about the kind of person he was, I would maintain that if you've got someone of a completely different temperament, someone like MacArthur's temperament or whatever, you're in a really tense situation here that would have been much tougher on Admiral Leahy and the president to try and sort this out and would have created more inter-service tension. So Nimitz is really the right person for the right time. I'm sometimes looking back at it, almost kind of appalled at MacArthur's behavior toward him and some of the things he said about him. Whether Nimitz knew that or not, who knows? But Nimitz just was so patient, so professional, so disciplined, and always thinking about the bigger picture of what was best for American and Allied grand strategy. And so even in the aftermath, when he doesn't get what he wants out of that conference there, obviously we go to the Philippines and not Formosa, Nimitz is very much on board and is working to help MacArthur as much as he possibly can. And I also believe that, when you really look at the record, I think that MacArthur gets a lot more of that relationship than does Nimitz in terms of when they're sharing resources like aircraft, of course, the shipping that MacArthur's going to need for his operations, and the aircraft carriers to give air support for his landings, things like that. I really think that MacArthur comes out ahead, and it's very, very seldom in a way that MacArthur can uphold his own promises of how he's going to support Nimitz, not because he's underhanded, but because he's into some pretty tough operations in the Philippines. So as we think back on Nimitz today, I think there's some good lessons there about an officer who really always understands the big picture, the kind of so what factor, and about how much personality and character factors into this whole thing. I just find that so intriguing. So I'll open up to questions here, and I don't know if I want it to be just me or bring in Jon, whatever. It's fine with me. Let's take a stab. Whatever questions you got, I really appreciate the interactive part of this. So let's have at it.
Okay. Before we do that, can I do just a quick thank you to Jon Parshall and Jon McManus for joining us today as we recognize Nimitz's birthday coming up, and just for sharing your thoughts on Nimitz and the type of person that he was. So thank you guys. And then we do have some questions in here, so I'm going to read them out so you guys have time to think of your answers. Okay.
Yeah.
So first one up, did the Admiral encounter any resentment from flag officers that he was promoted over?
That's a great question. Tangentially, I don't know the direct answer to that question, but I can answer that there was a sense on the part of Nimitz that he was not long for that command. I mean, famously, right after the beginning of the war, there is a document put together wherein King goes out to various sorts and asks them, okay, who are the top 40 admirals in the U.S. Navy? And, names like Spruance and Halsey end up on that list, and Nimitz's name does not end up on that list. And Nimitz is aware of that. In fact, he writes his wife, Catherine, at about the 3-month mark, that he says, I'll be lucky if I last here 6 months. So, Nimitz, I'm sure, was aware of the fact that he had been promoted over the heads of a lot of people, and he's in the middle of a pretty contentious initial working relationship with Ernie King as well, who was a difficult guy to get along with just in the best of times. And in the beginning of World War II, and everything is going pear-shaped everywhere all at once, King was not an easy guy to work for. So there you go.
And as Jon had mentioned earlier, of course, Nimitz could have had that job several months earlier. And you think about what would have been different in history. He probably would have been the one blamed for Pearl Harbor, or maybe he would have done a better job than Kimmel, and it wouldn't have been as big a disaster. Who knows? It's one of those imponderables. But one person I can think of who really is a bit of a burr in his saddle in a way is Admiral Tower, who is, is like the ultimate aviator, and thinks that an aviator ought to be in charge in that kind of position because obviously air power had become so important. And I really think he, as much as anybody, is a kind of challenger to Nimitz's authority, and Nimitz has to handle him. Once again, he just understands how to handle people, and he kind of puts him in his place, I think, in realizing, hey, aviation is important, but it's still one part of our larger skill set here.
Right.
I really think that's maybe his most contentious relationship. I could see David ask about Nimitz's relationship with General Richardson. That is so interesting to explore. Okay, so this is Lieutenant General Richardson, who was basically the ranking Army commander under Nimitz's command. So he's in a weird spot in that, he controls a lot of Army ground forces and service forces. And you would think, well, that's going to be with MacArthur, but no. I mean, obviously, Nimitz has a lot of Army forces that serve under his command in various invasions and elsewhere. And so Richardson had the opportunity to be a Corps commander earlier in the war, to command what they called I Corps back then. Nowadays, it's called First Corps. And he had temporized so much about the relationship with the Australians that George Marshall, the chief of staff of the Army, lost his patience with him and said, all right, the heck with this. I'm going to pick somebody else. And he picked, of course, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger with tremendous results. But Richardson then gets assigned to this very important but quite anonymous job that he found really frustrating. So what's kind of interesting, I mean, we're singing Nimitz's praises here today, and we should. But if you look at Richardson's diary, quite extensive, that he kept during the war, and the letters that he wrote, and then the memoir that he wrote after the war, Richardson really documented his experience as well. It's chock full of tension with Nimitz, anger over Nimitz doing this, that, or the other thing. But you have to remember the context that Richardson was like almost as parochial with his, promoting Army interests as like Holland Smith was with Marine Corps interests in a way. And Nimitz always has the bigger picture point of view. So just like with Admiral Tower, he's not going to satisfy him to the point that he thinks he should have as an aviator. He's also not going to satisfy Richardson the way Richardson thinks that the Army ought to have consideration. But it's just kind of an interesting viewpoint. I think ultimately Richardson does a fine job, and he and Nimitz work reasonably well together. But obviously there was plenty of tension.
Yep.
All right, we have another question in the chat. Do you think Nimitz should have relieved Halsey after the 2 Typhoon fiascos?
Yep. Short answer, yeah. It's interesting. Okay, so as many of you know, I do another podcast called The Unauthorized History of the Pacific War, and Seth and Bill Tody did a couple of episodes on those Nimitz Typhoons, and Bill, as an ex-naval officer himself, is just absolutely scathing in his treatment of Halsey, because the first Typhoon in particular, Typhoon Cobra, if you wanted to botch the fleet track, you couldn't have botched it any worse than Nimitz or that Halsey did in that case. It was just an absolute disaster. But to then do it a second time in 1945 and to be caught with your pants down yet again in a situation where your ships are not properly ballasted or properly fueled, because Halsey had a habit of just running his ships so hard that they were often in a low fuel state. And this is another thing that a guy named Sal Mercogliano, who is the owner of the What's Happening in Shipping podcast, talks about a lot. He's a real expert on early war logistics. Halsey was infamous for bringing task forces back, with the needle just hovering over empty, to the point that in some cases, Pearl Harbor would have to send out an additional fleet oiler just to make it possible for Halsey to get his task force back in the early parts of the war. So I think that from a purely, what do I want to say, seamanship standpoint, yeah, Halsey absolutely should have been relieved after that second snafu. But again, as John has alluded to, Nimitz has always got the big picture in mind, and he's aware of the fact that as this war is drawing to a close, the last thing we want to do is throw the Japanese any sort of lifelines in terms of their own morale, and that relieving Halsey would have been seen by the Japanese as, the Americans are weakening. Things aren't going as well for them as they want us to think, So that's the reason that Nimitz basically steps in to save Halsey's career, even though, honestly, from a sort of a hardcore viewpoint, he kind of didn't deserve to have it saved.
Yeah, I'd concur. I mean, I think he should have been gone. And on top of it, too, what happened at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where I know we've got, people have gone into that in great depth. And I know our friend Rich Frank has laid some of the blame for the fiasco with Tommy Kincaid, and I totally understand that. I still think Halsey's actions at Leyte Gulf were somewhat reckless as well in relation to what was the larger purpose of why we're there. Not only to wreck the remnants of their fleet, but also to invade successfully at Leyte and everything that's been made for the liberation of the Philippines. So when you add all that up, this is somebody who probably should not have been in command anymore. And yet it's kind of interesting to note, John makes a really good point, that maybe this is a morale boost for the Japanese if Halsey is relieved. And that points to these figures who have emerged during the war, who are almost like media stars in a way, like MacArthur being a very good example, especially with this cult of personality, but also Halsey was colorful and made good copy for the media of the time, and thus was sort of thought of as a national hero. And he had done some very good things in the war, especially in the Guadalcanal campaign. And he's a solid, aggressive commander, but he's reckless. And so the shame of this long term, in my view, of Halsey remaining in place is that he ends up getting the 5-star promotion rather than Admiral Spruance. I think John and I have talked about this. I think we concur that Admiral Spruance much better deserved that than did Halsey. So only my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree with that very much. Yeah.
Okay, next question up. Is there any evidence Admiral Nimitz was against or voiced opposition to the atomic bombings of Japan?
Boy, and here's where I want my inner Rich Frank very much. I think that there were a lot of senior U.S. military figures that, well, ex post facto, voiced concerns about the usage of those weapons. But at the same time, I think that in the moment, the thing that Nimitz was most against by the time you get to July of 1945 was doing an invasion of Japan. And that he had made it clear, starting as early as May of 45, he's letting King know that this just does not seem like a good idea to be going into Japan. And then as the intel estimates start becoming clearer and clearer as just the number of troops that the Japanese have pushed into Kyushu, that, it's not going to be 350,000 Japanese we're going to be up against. It's going to be 900,000. That Nimitz, was thinking that we just need to take invasion off the table at this point and basically starve them out, which we could have done, but would have killed millions more people in Japan in the process of doing that. And of course, killed even larger numbers of millions in the occupied regions in Greater Asia. So, was Nimitz uneasy with the usage of that weapon? Yeah, probably. But I think in the grand scheme of things, he was certainly comfortable in its being used at the moment to try to get the war over with as rapidly as possible.
And in the larger context, in a way, at this last stage, the various services all kind of want to bring the war to a conclusion in their own manner. The Navy with a blockade strategy, and also, airstrikes too, obviously. But Navy with a blockade, the Army Air Forces with firebombing and ultimately atomic bombing. So resolving it through strategic bombing, in other words, and then the ground forces through an invasion, as represented by MacArthur, who is really the biggest advocate of an invasion until he sees otherwise that maybe we don't need to. So to his credit, he lets go of that. But for a pretty long time, he wanted the invasion to happen. Now, he will later speak out against the atomic bomb too. So I've always thought that was a little bit odd because, and so some people have accused him of having such a monumental ego that he still wanted an invasion and all that. I don't think that's quite fair. But yeah, I mean, I guess being in the occupation and seeing the reality of what the atomic bombings had done, and his feeling for the Japanese people that he develops in the occupation, I suppose maybe brings into mind for him some of the moral questions of the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
All right. Next up, we have a question about FDR. So FDR obviously knew Nimitz and thought highly of him. How did that relationship come about?
I don't actually have the answer for that because I'm a one-trick pony and I do early war, World War II. So, all I know is that they knew each other. I mean, obviously, FDR had a great interest in the Navy, having been a former, assistant secretary of the Navy. And so, came into contact with Nimitz when he was head of the Bureau of Navigation. John, you got anything more elaborate than that?
Yeah, I think it was because FDR being so wired into the Navy had really developed a good sense by that stage, right before the U.S. is in the war, who the biggest talents were in the Navy going forward and who would be the best people to put in key positions. And FDR had a pretty good eye for that. What he does with George Marshall is very similar too, because he leapfrogs him over several officers who had greater seniority to make him Army Chief of Staff. And I think we'd all agree that was a very good call. So my take on the whole thing with FDR's relationship with Nimitz had been that he had spotted him earlier as a rising talent in the Navy. Interestingly, though, I don't know that they ever had any kind of great rapport relationship-wise. And, the image I showed earlier of the conference they have at Pearl Harbor, well, of course, FDR and MacArthur had known each other a long time because MacArthur was Army Chief of Staff during FDR's first term as president in the 1930s. And it was a very contentious relationship. And, of course, MacArthur being MacArthur, obviously was very political. Always cozy with the right wing with the Republican Party, and obviously had tried to run for president himself in 43 and 44. And you would think that would be really tense, but at the same time, these are two people who didn't like confrontation, and they liked they could both be quite genial and quite using humor and all of this kind of stuff. And so during that conference, MacArthur had a real advantage in the sense of having this previous relationship with FDR, and man, he used that because he would converse with him. And Nimitz was really more quiet, and he's more modest and self-effacing anyway. And so that certainly was an advantage for MacArthur at that moment. Even though, of course, there's no question FDR thought highly of Nimitz, but I don't know that they really knew each other all that well.
Yeah.
All right, I've got time for just a few more questions. For my at-home audience, I'm really sorry if we don't get to your question today, but we're going to try real quick to get at least 3 more in. So next one up. Many, including myself, which is John, Mr. John Bird, think Joe Rochefort was not fully / properly recognized with an award or career. Why did Nimitz not fight harder with King to get him what he deserved?
Yeah. One of the things about Nimitz, and John, I also wanted to say, I saw your other comment that yes, technically speaking, Mikasa is in Yokosuka and not in Tokyo. It's part of the greater Tokyo metropolitan area, though. I just like to point that out. It's only an hour away by train. Anyway, Nimitz had a really good sense for what battles he could win and what battles he could not win. And what was really going on from an intelligence processing standpoint at that point in time was the King in Washington wanted to centralize the assimilation and analysis of radio intelligence in Washington, D.C., in the OP-20G organization that was run by the infamous Redmond brothers. And that makes a certain amount of sense to have that sort of centralization. I get that. And Rochefort had rubbed the Redmonds the wrong way on a number of occasions, and so they had knives out for him. And Nimitz, when the word comes down that Rochefort is to be, transferred out of his responsibilities and given a different assignment, he just knows that this is not a battle he's going to win. That Ernie King wants it to be this way, and that Rochefort is going to be the fall guy, unfortunately. And this is one of those fights I just can't make it good. And so he cuts his losses. And actually, one of the Redmond brothers is going to end up in an intelligent capacity out in Pac Fleet. And Nimitz is a little cool with him when he first comes out, but eventually, creates a fairly good working relationship with him as well. So here's an example of Nimitz's political savviness, I would argue.
I would concur.
There you go.
Nothing more there.
All right, next one up. I have heard before that the reason FDR chose MacArthur over Nimitz is because MacArthur threatened to run against FDR for presidency if he did not. Any truth to that? So,
Johnny, you mind if I go first on this one? Yeah. So, I'm sort of deep into those weeds with this thing. MacArthur already had run for president against FDR and had lost by July 1944. In other words, he was not going to get the Republican nomination. This is one side of MacArthur that isn't that well known in this day and age, that in 43 and early 44, he's actively campaigning for the Republican nomination. Senator Arthur Vandenberg was running his campaign from D.C. MacArthur utilized members of his staff, most notably Dick Sutherland, to work with Vandenberg and try and advance his cause. Well, that was over by July 1944. So there's a lot of delving into what the conversations were between MacArthur and FDR at that point. I have never seen any evidence that during that conversation he threatens to run for president or other, and it wouldn't have been a clear and threatening kind of thing because MacArthur had already lost. Thomas Dewey was going to be the nominee for the Republicans. So what he could do, though, is he could give FDR some legitimacy in a way in other words, to continue as president to see the war through to its end. That association with MacArthur, who, of course, is held in very high regard by many of the American people, particularly on the more conservative political right, that this would help FDR's reelection chances in 1944. And that maybe in exchange for being photographed with MacArthur, hobnobbing with him, the sense that MacArthur approves of FDR's overall leadership of the military, then in exchange for that, we get to go to the Philippines instead of Formosa. Now, I've never found a direct evidentiary link to that. I do know that MacArthur had significantly more intimate conversations with FDR during the course of those couple of 3 days in the Pearl Harbor area than did Nimitz. And of course, Ernie King wasn't even in on the meeting by design. But to answer your question, Joseph, there is no evidence of my knowledge that MacArthur makes that kind of threat. In fact, the conversations tended to be much more congenial. So this would have been much against the kind of mood for the way things were at that point.
Yeah, I would just add to that, not to talk about the politics because you got that nailed down, but I would say too that just from an overall strategic standpoint, going into Formosa was just not a good option. Formosa had been occupied by the Japanese for decades. The terrain was awful. It was going to take just unbelievable quantities of logistics to get that far over to it. And it was not going to be as good a jumping off point for operations against Japan as Okinawa ultimately turned out to be. Two, for the sake of the Filipino people, and I'm not a huge MacArthur fan, but I do think that when MacArthur argued during that conference that we owe the Filipino people to relieve them, of this burden that they are bearing under Japanese occupation, that ultimately turned out to be a really good thing for the Philippines, and that we unquestionably saved, millions of people there, potentially from starvation and, just further bestiality at the part of their Japanese occupiers. And so I think going into the Philippines versus Formosa was much the better option.
All right. It's time for our last question of the day. And this one is, could you please give suggestions for reading? For example, I know little about Richardson.
And I'll let you do the Richardson thing. But I would say that in terms of biographies of Nimitz, there are two very good ones that have come out in just the last couple of years. Nimitz at War by Craig Simons is excellent. And then Trent Hone also at pretty much the same time had a book on Nimitz called Mastering the Art of Command. They're both excellent. John?
Yeah, I agree 100%. Those are tremendous books. Highly recommend them. In relation to Richardson, unfortunately, there's no biography, no published biography that you can read of him. You can read of him in the context of other studies. And obviously, this is self-promoting. You can read about him in my trilogy, though he's not like a main front and center character, but he's there a lot. He's more like tangential because of the nature of his duties, that he has not really survived as a kind of front and center personality. So there isn't a lot of literature out there on him. But particularly too, if you like, some of these volumes are pretty dry, but the Army's official histories, especially like on the support and logistical side, and the training side, you'll see Richardson pop up there because that's what he's doing. And the thing about him too, towards the end of the war, he really would like a combat command in a way, and yet he had one in the palm of his hand and lost it because of his own temporizing, because he just didn't seem to understand how he was going to work with allies somehow. So he's a bit of a tragic figure in that sense. I think Richardson wanted to be much better known. And he has a grandson by the same name, Robert Richardson, who certainly would concur with that. And he was very helpful to me, by the way, providing me copies of his diary and that. But these are like archival sources, and unfortunately, I can't point to a lot of published stuff that you can look at. But I would encourage you to explore him a little bit more, where you do see him in the context of other works.
Yeah.
All right. I would like to thank our guest speakers for today. Thank you guys for coming and sharing your favorite facts and stories about Nimitz and helping us to get to know him a little bit better. And for our at-home audience, I want to thank you for spending part of your day with us. We really appreciate that. But thank you again for joining us today. And I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next time.